Let me warmly welcome Professor Axel Klein. He is Professor of Social Sciences of East Asia and Japanese Politics at the Institute of East Asian Studies at Duisburg-Essen University. So you realize that he's a colleague. I'm very pleased to see him here. He has an educational background in political science and Japanese studies from Bonn University in particular, spent several years at the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo, and has numerous publications on domestic politics of Japan, party politics. But if I just mention one work, I would like to mention a film, a documentary film he has made, very deep insights, pictures at an election about the 2008 general election in Japan, and you can still see it on YouTube if you like. So warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Vielen, vielen Dank, Werner. Schön, dich wiederzusehen. Thank you very much for having me today, ladies and gentlemen. I do realize that I'm the only one at this conference talking about just one country, and it is a country that usually doesn't come up when we talk about populism. So I hope you will stay with us, stay with me for the next 20 minutes to learn a little bit about this apparent outlier to the discussion on populism. And maybe we can address the question at the end of this presentation together. Why is it an outlier? That's something I think is of real interest to all of us at this conference. Now, I'm part of a project that is called Populism in East Asian Democracies, PIN-EAD for short, with Hannes Mosler and Frederik Krumbein, who deal with South Korea and Taiwan. If you're interested, about a year ago, we had a lecture series on all of these three liberal democracies. If you like, they're also available on YouTube. You can watch them there. So if I had to put a short introduction to the political system of Japan on one slide and one slide only, it would look like this. Because Japan is a one-party dominant regime, that's really all you need to keep in mind when I walk you through my little presentation here. The Liberal Democratic Party has been in power 62 of 66 years of its existence, and the present prime minister, its 27th of the LDP, is called Kishida Fumio. You may not be familiar with him yet. He's only been in office for a few months. So that's key to understand Japanese politics. There's one party that runs the show, has been running the show for many, many decades, and it's really tough for the opposition to take over. Now, if we turn to populism, there are some people who say there is no populism in Japan. Here are some of the articles that I prepared for today. Ian Buruma, very well-known scholar on East Asia, says, why is Japan populist free? Jennifer Lind asks why populism missed Japan, and there's more. And if you read these articles, you come up with these answers here in the gray box on the right. We say there is a relatively egalitarian society in Japan that prevents populism. There is a lack of elites that have betrayed the people. The government has made Japan one of the most protected and least globalized in the developed world. And the final point is there's very little immigration to Japan, which takes apparently away one of the hot button issues that usually cause populism. But there are other voices that say, no, there is populism in Japan. There is populism. And in the public discourse, populism is generally referred to as mass opportunism. Here are the Japanese characters for this, meaning that whenever a politician is too generous with public opinion and tries to satisfy the audience, the target groups, if he behaves in a way that others can consider to be irresponsible, then that is generally called populism. You raise child allowance, that's populism. You reduce taxes, that's populism. Here, Prime Minister Abe, the longest serving prime minister in Japan from 2012 to 2020, he serves as an example of a populist for one of the leading newspapers of the country. And I put these two quotes up here because I think they give you an idea of why people are called populists in Japan by Japanese. And you can see here, he has kept referring to the years of the former Democratic Party of Japan administration as a nightmare. So there were 3 years from 2009 to 2012 when the Democratic Party of Japan ran the country. The LDP was in opposition, and the LDP prime minister then later said that was a nightmare. And what he gets from this newspaper here is the label populist. And a second point, piece of evidence, so to speak, for this newspaper is to say he ignored the government's traditional interpretation of the Constitution in pushing his controversial national security legislation. Apparently, that also makes him a populist in the eyes of this newspaper. Now, we've heard a lot about the different ways and concepts and approaches to populism and how it can be defined. You may remember most of these aspects. I'll get to them in a moment to remind you. But let's look at another potential candidate as populist, and that's Koizumi Tonitiro. If you're not familiar with Japan, he was prime minister from 2001 to 2006. And here in these 4 boxes, I summarized the reasons why he was referred to as a populist by not only one newspaper, but all the newspapers and a lot of academic publications. And I'm not even talking about mainstream journalism here. He had a different leadership style, meaning that he attacked people in his own party as being too inflexible and adverse to reform. He was media savvy, and up until his tenure, most Japanese prime ministers were, and you excuse my French here, they were really boring in terms of how they addressed the public, how they would hold press conferences, how they would deliver campaign speeches. He was different. He was interesting. He had this struggle against the LDP mainstream, so against the old guard within his own party, for the reforms, which is the 4th point that he wanted to push. And if you could pick one area in a liberal democracy that you think would be appropriate for a populist to push, I'm sure you wouldn't come up with the field that Koizumi picked, which was postal privatization. I think postal privatization is far from anything that populists would usually dream of as being the right topic. But for him, it was postal privatization. So you can see why he was referred to as a populist. You may not understand this, you may not agree with it, but you see what happened in Japan. And foreigners, foreign scholars who observed Japan, they picked up this label and said Koizumi is a populist, although they had a hard time arguing for it. So as the question by Iraklis Milas before already made clear, we have a lot of conceptual confusion, but we don't need to go into this. I think there is no time for that. It's quite an academic discussion. I think what this conference here is about, first of all, is those people who mobilize the people to undermine democracy, to undermine liberal democracy, and move the country into a direction that is closer to authoritarianism. So if we keep that in mind, I can almost, but only almost, skip this slide, which summarizes 2 of the points that Professor Wirtz mentioned 2 presentations before, which is the political strategic approach and the ideational approach. And if you just look at the red terms, there is a personalistic leader, and he's enjoying support from large numbers of mostly unorganized followers. That's all you have to keep in mind for the political strategic approach for the purpose of this presentation. And then there's the ideational approach, a thin-centered ideology, meaning you can replace ideology, you can use a lot of it or not, but it's not really key to this understanding of populism. Key is this antagonistic camp of the pure people and the other one, the corrupt elite. And then there's the general idea of volontaire général, a general will of the people. But if we apply these two concepts to Koizumi, won't check many boxes. It's no identification of the people with Koizumi. He never used that rhetorical pattern. There is no rhetorical empowerment of the people, and there is no populist twist, meaning that once he got into office, that he would then claim to be talking for all of the people. He didn't really care, at least he pretended to. The ideational approach doesn't fit either. There is no radical antagonism between virtuous people and a corrupt elite. There is no anti-pluralism, no anti-liberalism, and never once did he talk about the enemies of the people. So it'd be really difficult to call him a populist. There are more examples. The other examples are different because they are local politicians. They are not working on the national level in Japanese politics. And the first one I would like to introduce altogether, I think I have 4 of them, really quickly, is a guy who founded Rewa Since. And it's there is no English translation for this. The party doesn't offer any. Rewa is the name of the present emperor era. And Shinsengumi used to be a group of samurai a couple of centuries ago. So he is trying to be that group of people who observe the best in Japan, in contemporary Japan. And for those of you who can read Japanese or Chinese, probably the same characters here, I put a circle around these 2 key characters. It's love and money. That's what he says. Japanese people, what they lack is more love and more money from the state. He wants to build a country that offers that to everyone around. So, 何があっても心配するな。そんな国をあなたと作りたい. So whatever happens, don't worry. That's the kind of country I want to build with you. That's the kind of rhetoric that he uses. And he sells these T-shirts, you can see in the lower left corner, that say, who is wearing this is Japan's highest sovereign, to get the idea back into people's heads that they are the ones who should run the country. So this would be a populism from the left, if you wanted to, but this party is still very, very small. It's been around for 3 years. There are just 3 seats in the lower house and 2 seats in the upper house. And he himself doesn't use any of the rhetoric that usually is immediately comes to mind when you talk about populist leaders. So that makes it a little bit difficult, but let's keep that in mind for the time being. There's another person, Onaga Takeshi, actually he died 2 years ago, who is the governor of Okinawa, these islands to the southwest of the main islands in Japan. And he had just one issue, and that issue was get rid of as many US soldiers and military bases as possible. That was his issue, and that's what he campaigned for, and that's why he used this idea of we on Okinawa are one group of people, and we need to fight the central government in Japan, in Tokyo. So if we think about populism as something that puts the corrupt elite against the virtuous people, now here the question remains, as the case with every form of regional populism, what happens to the other 115 million people who do not live on Okinawa, or there may be even more than that? How are they part of this equation? But anyway, it was a single issue movement, but there is literature out there that calls Onaga a populist. No illiberalism, no anti-pluralism. There is no talk of nativism, xenophobia, any of these things, nothing. He just wanted to get rid of US military bases on Okinawa. And then finally, 2 more. Koike Yuriko is the governor of Tokyo, who created a party called People from Tokyo First. That was the name of her party. And that was sufficient to provoke some Japanese political scientists to look into her rhetoric and her campaign proposals if they weren't populist. And we get to that in a moment, the results of that analysis. And the guy on the bottom of this slide, Hashimoto Toru, used to be a lawyer, then became a governor in Osaka. And he was called a populist because he appeared to be quite aggressive in his way of attacking others, the bureaucracy, the central government, labor unions. A lot of people actually got attacked by him, and that made him a populist in the eyes of traditional mass media, but also some scholars like my colleague Yoshida Toru from Hokkaido University. Which brings me to a key point here. Who's a Pino and who's a populist? And Pino is my way of saying populist in name only. That's my abbreviation for the idea that some people are called populists, even though they may not really be populist. And we already heard today the term populist can be used to attack people, be part of competition, electoral competition. So, and if you look at these extremes that I put up here on the slide, on the left, for example, you have political competition, and on the right, there's radical antagonism. And in between, you have these large, many shades of gray. And the question is, how do you determine whether attacking your opponent, criticizing them, is just political competition or already the Manichaean struggle that Mude and others require populists to use? The same is true for when do your supporters turn into virtuous people? And when do voters turn into the people? And when does criticism of decision makers cross the border to becoming a fight against morally corrupt elites? So what I'm trying to say with this slide here is that the local political culture, and that's true, I think, many countries, is often an implicit background against which to measure and label actors and their rhetoric and their activities as populist. And the political culture in Japan clearly calls people like Koizumi a populist, who with the same behavior, I'm sure in no European country would be referred to as a populist. But for the political culture in Japan, his way of competing with his own party, his way of pushing his ideas was different. It was different, and that helped to label him populist. So if I summarize this, I'd say there is no populist party in Japan. None of the actors that I introduced to you are a party. And there is no populist politician resembling the populists that we discuss at this conference, I think. And the small number of phenomena that I've introduced to you, I think they allow Japan to score low on populism. So the next question would be, why is there so little populism in Japan? And if you look at the country, you can find a lot of reasons why there should be more. There's rising social inequality. There is one dominant party and ministerial bureaucracy that could easily be referred to as the corrupt elites. You have an economic and financial crisis every now and then, starting really from the early 1990s. And Werner is much more the competent person to talk to here. From the 1990s onwards, we've had a number of these crises. There are negative effects of globalization on parts of the Japanese population. And there is a large political frustration which leads 45, almost half of Japanese voters to not cast their ballot, to forgo their right to vote. overall turnout at general elections is a little bit over 50%, 55, I think, the last election we saw. So there are reasons. All of these points could be called causes for populism, but still we don't have much. And here is one attempt to answer the question, why not? And I think one piece of the puzzle is that polarization may be the missing link. And because we don't have much time, I can't go into details here, but political education in Japan, political socialization in general, doesn't encourage people to develop their own opinion and to be open about it, discuss and argue for their own opinion. The political system is a closed shop. It's really difficult to become a politician. It's very expensive. And a lot of people, to borrow the term from Hirschman, chooses exit over voice. And this one dominant party is a catch-all party that has again and again tried to take issues away from the opposition whenever possible. And finally, there's a lot of criticism directed at the traditional mass media in Japan for being also a closed shop that doesn't like to be too critical of the government. Now, a final slide that summarizes what I've told you today about Japan. I think there's hardly an element of this kind of populism that we are looking at that undermines democracy. There is no political party that is running on xenophobia, anti-pluralism, or anti-elitism. Local politicians labeled populists on different definitional grounds. Remember the Pino versus populist slide. There is hardly an immigration into Japan to speak of, and the heartland that is so often referred to as the forgotten people in the US and other countries is not really forgotten in Japan. And the reasons why there's very little polarization, I think I just mentioned on the previous slides, is because of political socialization and education. It's because the political system is a closed shop, because there's a one-party dominance, and maybe also because of a value system that doesn't necessarily favor open disagreements and maybe even competitive attacks against political opponents. Thank you very much.